Hello, and welcome to part 2 of my video series on Vietnamese pronunciation. In the last video, we discussed the consonants, and in this one, I want to talk about the vowels and the tones. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, then I'd recommend you check that out first. But for the rest of you, let's begin. I'd like to start this section with a pop quiz. How many vowels are there in English? The correct answer is D, more than 8. I think this kind of answer can be a little bit surprising because we tend to think of English in terms of the alphabet, which has 6 vowels. But take a look at this. On screen, we have the words kit, pink, and right. Each of them use the letter I, but they make completely different sounds. So if we're counting the number of sounds rather than the number of letters, then we're going to find more than 6 vowels in English. Now, I can't give you a definitive number of vowels used in English because it changes based on the dialect you speak. But the dialect I speak uses the following 10 vowels. E as in beat, I as in kit, E, A, O, U, and finally the schwa, pronounced
Why is the chart shaped like that?
This is why. Now, out of all the vowels, I think the one that sticks out the most is the schwa. The schwa has become weirdly iconic in linguistics, kind of like the number pi in mathematics. It's often used as a sort of mascot to represent the field as a whole. So what is the schwa? The schwa is the most common vowel sound in English. It's this sort of shortened, unemphasized vowel that only appears in unstressed syllables. For example, in the word compatible, the schwa appears twice. Now, in addition to the 10 base vowels, there's also combination sounds, which we call diphthongs. For example, the A sound, as in bait, is actually a combination of the sounds E and E, bait. We also have I, oi, and ow. Now, any discussion of English vowels wouldn't be complete without at least mentioning the sound, as in the word bird. Technically, it isn't a vowel, but sometimes it behaves like one, and so sometimes people include it on the vowel chart. And based on the way the chart is organized, the sound would actually go right in the center, actually overlapping with the schwa and mud vowels. Another interesting thing is that you can also make diphthongs with the sound. For example, ear, or r. And all this stuff is fun and interesting, and there's even more that we could discuss, but the video's already long enough without opening this can of worms. So for our purposes, I'd like to mostly ignore this sound and pretend it doesn't exist. Now, the last thing I want to show you with the English vowels is this sort of universal truth which applies to all languages, which is that the vowels are inherently fuzzy and ill-defined, and that makes them extremely prone to regional variation. So for example, if you compare the pronunciation of the word right across different dialects, you'll see lots of variation. The way I say it starts around the vowel and ends towards E, right. On the other hand, if you are from Australia, you might actually start around the vowel, saying right. If you had an Irish accent, you might start around the vowel, saying right. And if you have a southern US accent, you'd actually start on the vowel and mostly just stay there, right. The regional variation in vowel sounds makes them really difficult to pinpoint in any language, and Vietnamese is no exception. And unfortunately, I'm only actually familiar with the Saigon dialect, so in a moment, when we get to the Vietnamese vowels, I'll only be giving you the pronunciation used in Saigon. If you're after a different dialect, then this will still work as a decent starting point. Just keep your ear out, because there will be differences in pronunciation in your preferred dialect. Now that that's cleared up, let's move on to Vietnamese then. Here, we have all the Vietnamese vowels in their proper places. And unlike in English, Vietnamese has this really nice property where every letter only ever makes a single sound, so we can actually just use the letters on the chart rather than example words like we had to do in English. The first vowel we have is E, as in in or ki. In Vietnamese, the letter Y is strictly a vowel, and this can sometimes cause some confusion, so try to keep it in mind. The sound itself, though, is identical to the English E vowel, so it shouldn't be too hard. The next vowel is as in hut. In terms of the chart, this sound would go in the middle of the English kit, dress, and mud vowels. So if you're having trouble with this one, keep on trying different vowels in that general area until you find a nice middle ground. Now, some foreigners pronounce this vowel the same as the English dress vowel, and that works, but it can also lead to some confusion, because Vietnamese has this letter, which is actually pronounced like the dress vowel. The other thing I should mention, the circumflex accent above this is actually part of the letter itself. It's not a diacritic. The next vowel is as in sem, and this one's pretty straightforward. The next vowel is as in cat. This vowel is between the English cat and mud vowels, but of the two, I'd say it's a little bit closer to the mud vowel. So if you need to, you can get by just approximating this sound using the English vowel, rather than the more proper sound. The next vowel is as in nya or mat. Supposedly, the different letters represent different sounds, but I've never been able to differentiate them, and personally, I'm convinced that they've actually merged into one sound, at least in the Saigon dialect, that is. Now, you want to be careful making this sound because there's a special sound change that occurred in English which is going to cause a lot of interference if you're not careful. Which is that if the sound falls before a nasal sound, like ma, na, or nga, then the nasal sound will actually strongly affect the turning it into something that more resembles an sound. So if you compare the English words lamb and hat, you'll notice that the vowel sounds different. But then if you look at the Vietnamese words lam, to do, and hat, to sing, you'll notice that the vowel is the same. So for practice, see if you can say the word lamb using the vowel instead of The next vowel is as in hong. This vowel is used in English, it's the same as in the word hot, so this one should be pretty easy. The next vowel is o, as in so. This vowel is pretty similar to the O vowel in English, but there is one thing to watch out for, especially if you're an American, and even more particularly if you're a Southern American, which is that our O sound is not a pure O, rather, it drifts towards oo near the end. If you say a word like go really slowly, you should be able to hear it. Now in most languages, including Vietnamese, you want to make your O as a pure O sound. So if you can, try to ditch the oo off of your O sounds. But if you can't do that, then don't worry about it. It's not such a big deal. Now, the next two vowels have always given me a lot of trouble, so I'm going to present them together. First, we have as in hun, followed by as in g. These two vowels, which we'll call O horn and U horn for now, are really similar to the English book vowel. But, as you can see on the chart, O horn is closer to the O vowel, while U horn is closer to the U vowel. Now, if you're unable to make the distinction between versus then you can probably get by just approximating them both using the English book vowel, but you should at least try to pronounce them differently in your practice. And after that, we have our last vowel, oo, as in loop, and this vowel's nice and easy because it's identical to the English oo vowel. And that's all the vowels in Vietnamese. Now, before I move on to the next section though, I do want to make a quick note on the schwa sound, because although schwa isn't an official sound used in Vietnamese, it actually is pronounced in a few words. You see it most often in common words that serve some sort of grammatical function, so things like prepositions, particles, and classifiers. And the reason you see it in those words specifically is because they have very little semantic content, and so they're very easy to predict, so you don't need to be too careful about how you pronounce them. The best example of this is probably the word ge, which pretty much is always pronounced with a schwa sound, rather than a more deliberate ge. But again, as I said, the schwa is pretty rare in Vietnamese, so it's not something that you really need to be worrying about. With that out of the way, we can move on to the diphthongs. So as a refresher, a diphthong is a vowel sound composed of other vowels, and English only has a handful of valid combinations, such as a, oi, I, and ow. Vietnamese, on the other hand, has way more variety, and I've made this chart here to show you what I mean. On the left-hand column, we have our starting vowel, while on the top row, we have the second vowel. So, for example, the diphthong oi starts on the O vowel, so it belongs in this row somewhere, and it ends on the E vowel, so it should go in this column. And there it is. So Vietnamese has a lot of the same diphthongs that are in English. They have I, oi, and ow, for example. But funnily enough, a does not exist in Vietnamese. Don't be too disappointed though, because there's plenty of others to make up for it. One thing you want to really look out for is that it's really easy to separate the vowels when you really want to blend them together as much as possible. This, for example, should be pronounced ear, not something like iya. This should be uo, not uwo. And this should be oa, not something like ah. The other thing you should be careful of is the letter O. We discussed before that on its own, the letter O makes the ah sound. But if it appears at the end of a diphthong, you want to pronounce it as O. So this should be I with a ah sound, but this should be L with a O sound. In addition to diphthongs, Vietnamese also has a couple of triphthongs with 3 sounds. So here we have eo as in heo, oi as in loi, oi as in ngoi, o as in ro, uoi as in tuoi, and ue as in tuet. A lot of these can be pretty tricky, so just keep practicing until you feel like you've gotten it. If you're having a lot of trouble making some of the sounds though, it can also be pretty helpful to find some listening material and just try to get used to how Vietnamese people talk. Also remember that each of these combinations should be a single syllable long, so try to really blend the sounds together as much as possible. And with that, I think we can move on to the tones. So I think tone gets a bad rap in terms of language features. About 30% of world languages have tones of some sort, but I think people tend to think of it as this rare and exotic and unusual feature that makes a language so unbelievably difficult. And I'll be the first to tell you that even compared to other tonal languages, the Vietnamese tones are notoriously difficult. But tones are a natural part of human language, and I think every person has it in them to speak a tonal language if they want to. But before I discuss the Vietnamese tones themselves, I want to start with a comparison to English stress, and then move on to a little discussion about what it actually means if a language has tones. So, some of you are probably aware of a thing in English that we call stress. And the way stress works in English is that in every word, one syllable has to be given stress, meaning you pronounce that syllable louder and longer. The difference between stressed and unstressed is really easy to appreciate in minimal pairs, like convict versus convict, or another famous example is conduct versus conduct. And word pairs like this with variable stress are kind of cool, but they don't really reflect any deeper truths about English grammar. You can't just take any random word, change the stress around, and expect a valid word to come out. Rather, it's just that these handful of words happen to develop this way. So let's talk about English stress a little more explicitly. Firstly, a syllable can be in one of 2 states, stressed or unstressed. Secondly, stress affects a syllable's volume and duration. Thirdly, stress is assigned arbitrarily. And finally, we as English speakers listen for stress in order to help differentiate between different words. In Vietnamese, we have much the same story. Here we have some words, and each one is assigned their own tones, which help us distinguish between them. This word is 2 syllables long, and as you can see, each syllable uses a different tone, and that's not too surprising. But what's kind of strange is that this word is spaced out as if the 2 syllables were different words. And this is a writing convention that exists in Vietnamese, where if a word is multiple syllables long, then each syllable is written out with a space in between. Now, this writing convention has caused a lot of confusion surrounding Vietnamese, because some people have seen this and said, "Oh look, Vietnamese only allows single-syllable words. What a strange language." Or they've looked at it and said, "Oh look, Vietnamese has a fundamentally different approach to word building than we have in English." But in reality, it's just that the designers of the writing system thought it looked better this way, and that's the reason why they do this. Getting back on topic though, let's go back to the slide where I was comparing English stress and Vietnamese tone. In Vietnamese, each syllable can be assigned one of 6 tones, which for our purposes we'll call flat, rising, falling, dipping, wavering, and halting. Secondly, a tone affects a syllable's pitch contour or pitch melody, a thing we call glottalization, and its duration. Like in English, Vietnamese tones are assigned arbitrarily, and also like in English, the Vietnamese speakers listen for tones in order to distinguish between different words. And now that we got the basic idea of tone covered, I want to address some common concerns about speaking a tonal language, so let's go through them.
Do I need to be able to sing in order to make the tones?
It'll definitely help if you can sing, but it's not necessary by any means. The actual vocal range that you need to cover for the tones is less than an octave, which is easily doable even if you're untrained. That said though, any amount of musical training is going to help a lot, and especially with a language like Vietnamese.
Do I need perfect pitch to get the tones right?
The tones aren't based on absolute pitch. You're not going to be expected to match pitch with a perfect middle C or anything. It's based very broadly on the rising and falling of pitch, and it's not as precise as you may think.
How are Vietnamese people able to express themselves if they have to fit their voice to match the tones?
Just because Vietnamese is tonal, it doesn't affect their ability to emphasize certain words or convey emotions by changing your prosody like we do in English. Vietnamese people are just as expressive as any other people.
Do the tones ever encode grammatical info? Like, could I change a tone to convert a verb into a noun?
Nope. The tones are essentially assigned randomly to each word. You won't find any rhyme or reason to it, even if you look.
Is there a rule that says anything like, one tone isn't allowed to appear before another tone?
Nope.
Are any of the tones more rare or more common than the others, or are they more or less equally distributed?
I've not looked much into that, but from my experience, the wavering tone is the rarest, and the rising and falling are probably the most common.
How did the tones come about? Was Vietnamese always a tonal language?
Actually, no. Vietnamese was not always tonal, and the evolution of its tones is actually pretty well accounted for, and while I'm no expert, I can give you my best understanding of how they evolved. You may recall, when I was talking about vowels, how I mentioned a sound change in English involving the a vowel and nasal sounds, where in a word like lamb, the nasal m sound was actually coloring the vowel before it, turning a into an. In Vietnamese, this sort of thing happened way more extensively, where we had all kinds of consonants having special effects on the vowels before them. Over time, these special effects became more and more prominent, while the actual consonants slowly eroded over time. And if you recall my discussion of syllable codas, where I said you can only end a Vietnamese word with a voiceless stop or a nasal, this is the reason why, because all the other sounds just turned into tones.
That was the last question.
Awesome, let's move on then. Now at this point, we're ready to talk about the actual tones themselves. And unfortunately, a lot like the vowels, the tones are pretty fuzzy and hard to define. And depending on the region, there's a lot of variation in how they're pronounced. Luckily though, I found some nice diagrams off of Wikipedia showing how they're pronounced in different regions. And in classic Wikipedia fashion, they're a good start, but you shouldn't take them at face value. They show the pitch contours of the 6 tones as pronounced by individual speakers. The chart on the left represents a speaker from Hanoi, while the right, a speaker from somewhere in the south. It looks consistent with the Saigon dialect, but it didn't say exactly. Now, the reason you shouldn't take these at face value is because they're produced from individuals pronouncing the tones in a highly unrealistic setting. That is, in sequence, in isolation, and the recordings were probably cherry-picked using the clearest take. This tells us what they think is the quote-unquote correct pronunciation, rather than how they'd authentically pronounce it in an actual conversation. And you can criticize that for being inauthentic, but for our purposes, I think that's actually incredibly useful, because it gives us a nice, simplified intermediate step that we can use kind of like training wheels. Now, on the graphs, you can see we have time on the x-axis, measured in milliseconds here, and measured in percentages on this one. While on the y-axis, we have pitch, measured in semitones. And if you're familiar with what a semitone is, this probably seems like a strange choice, but there's actually a good reason behind it. A semitone is an interval that comes from music. Here's an example of one. Each semitone represents a roughly 6% increase in frequency, with a compounding effect, so that 12 semitones will double the frequency, and this corresponds with the 12 notes in an octave. The other thing about semitones is that they're not tied to any specific frequencies. They just represent a proportional comparison between 2 or more sounds. So, returning to the graphs describing the tones, the basic idea is to find a pitch that you're comfortable making, and then the Vietnamese tones will span a few semitones above and below it. And now that we understand the theory behind it, let's actually look at the tones themselves. The first and easiest is the flat tone, which the Vietnamese call ngang. And as you can see, for this tone, you basically just want to find a kind of high pitch and then hold it out for the duration of a syllable, as in the word con dem. And you'll notice with this word that there's no accent marks, and the philosophy behind this is that this tone is kind of considered as the most neutral one, and so you're supposed to see the lack of any accent marks and infer to use this one. The next tone we have is the rising tone, which the Vietnamese call sac. This one's pretty self-explanatory, you just want to steadily increase pitch. And as an example, we have the word qua. The next tone is the falling tone, which the Vietnamese call huyen. Now, as far as pitch is concerned, this tone's pretty simple. You basically just want to steadily decrease pitch as you go along. But there's another special thing about this tone, which I know is true in Saigon, but I'm not sure about other dialects. And that is that this tone is supposed to be glottalized. And glottalization is just a fancy term for a thing you might know as creaky voice. But what is creaky voice, you might ask? Well, creaky voice is essentially if you put just the right amount of tension on your vocal cords, then you can cause them to sort of misfire as you speak, and that'll cause your voice to sound like this. Now, in the US, creaky voice is kind of looked down upon. We have this stereotype of the valley girl who constantly uses it, and we like to make fun of them for it. But in Vietnamese, it's a pretty important part of some of the tones. So if you want to speak Vietnamese more authentically, then you should practice the huyen tone using creaky voice. On the other hand, though, creaky voice is actually pretty bad for your throat, so you shouldn't practice it too much. If you're ever speaking Vietnamese and your throat starts to hurt, then you should try to tone down the creaky voice, because you might be accidentally hurting yourself without even realizing it. In any case though, our example word for the falling tone is the, which means from. Next up, we have the halting tone, which the Vietnamese call nang. And as you can see, this is the first tone where there's a real difference in pronunciation between the Hanoi and Saigon dialects. But basically, in Hanoi, it starts around mid-range and quickly lowers, while in Saigon, it starts low and mostly stays low. For this tone, you also want to use creaky voice, so in that sense, it's pretty similar to huyen. What makes this tone special, though, is that it has a very short duration. So if a syllable has this tone, you want to spend a very small amount of time actually pronouncing it. So, as an example, we have this word, which in Hanoi should sound something like duh, while in the South should sound like duh. Next up, we have the dipping tone, which the Vietnamese call hai. In Hanoi, this tone starts off with this mid-range plateau shape, giving away to this drop here, while in Saigon, we have this small initial dip, followed by a dramatic ascent in pitch. The other difference that the charts don't really show very well is that the Saigon pronunciation should last noticeably longer than the Hanoi pronunciation. So for example, we have this word, which in Hanoi would be pronounced something along the lines of to, while in Saigon would be pronounced to. Last but not least, we have the wavering tone, which the Vietnamese call ngã. Now this tone is definitely the weirdest of them all, so there's kind of a lot to talk about. First thing I should mention is that this tone actually merged with ha'ai in Saigon, so this tone and ha'ai are pronounced identically there. In the north though, it is still pronounced as its own thing, and if you look on the chart, you can see that there's something kind of strange going on here. So we start on a relatively high pitch going down, which is all fine, but then after a tenth of a second, it just stops, and we have a gap here. And in the middle of the gap, there's this squiggly line. Now the squiggly line is actually a letter. It's the IPA symbol for a glottal stop. And a glottal stop is just a really fancy way of saying to pause sound production. So you make the pause, and then when you resume, as you can see, you just increase pitch until it finally ends. So to put everything together, let's take a look at our example word, which in Hanoi should sound something like me, or in Saigon, me. And with that, we've covered all the tones. Now, I want to remind you, as I said before, that this is a pretty idealized picture of the tones. And so during your studies or your travels, when you hear real, authentic Vietnamese being spoken, try to listen closely to how it's pronounced in a more natural setting. because in the real world, things are going to be a lot more messy, and you'll need a keen ear to pick out the finer details. And now, let's try to finish the video off with my final review and some closing thoughts. The review will take the form of a pop quiz. Let's see how much you remember. This word on screen means reason. How do you pronounce it? In Hanoi, up north, it would be pronounced za, while in Saigon, it would be pronounced ya. This word means drunk. It's pronounced sai. In Vietnamese, the letter S represents a retracted S sound, which is closer to sh. This word means up. It's pronounced lên. This word means to blame. It's pronounced chak. The sequence TR is pronounced ch, while the sequence CH is pronounced k at the end of words. This word means difficult. It's pronounced kha. This word means magic. It's pronounced phép màu. This word means boot. It's pronounced ung. Remember that the O and U vowels are going to color the NG sound, turning it into something that sounds more like an M. This word means information. It's pronounced thông tin. Remember that TH is aspirated, while T on its own is unaspirated. This word means peaceful or undisturbed. It's pronounced yên. Remember that the letter Y is strictly a vowel in Vietnamese. This word means to do or to make. It's pronounced làm. This word means very. In the north, it's pronounced zat, while in the south, it's pronounced rat. This word means to sit. It's pronounced ngồi. This word means to hate. It's pronounced ghét. This word means small. It's pronounced nhỏ. This word means to read. It's pronounced da. This word means now. In Hanoi, it's pronounced bây giờ. In the south, it's pronounced bây giờ. This word means and. In Hanoi, it's pronounced va, while in Saigon, it's pronounced yeah. And finally, for bonus points, this word is the last name of many Vietnamese people. How do you pronounce it? The answer is Nguyen. So, how did you do? Let me know in the comments. I'm curious to see how well the video works as a teaching tool, so I really would like to hear your feedback. But before I end the video, there's one more thing I want to cover, which is study tips and how to study effectively. So let's talk a bit about that. So, I have a cynical view on textbooks. I think there's this widespread idea that you can get all or most of the essential knowledge from a textbook. But really, a textbook should have a very limited role in your studies. Basically, if you're using the language and you come across something that confuses you, you can use the textbook as a reference to help clear up the confusion. But if you're spending a large portion of your study time in the textbook, then you're probably doing it wrong. Vietnamese classes are really hard to find. There are a handful of universities in the United States that offer Vietnamese courses, but I personally have never attended one. You can find individual tutors online, and that can always be helpful, but Vietnamese in general is a pretty low-demand language, and so a lot of Vietnamese teachers are pretty inexperienced. If you do end up in a class or with a private tutor though, just keep in mind that the class on its own isn't going to be enough to get you very far. You're going to need to supplement the class with a lot of self-driven study as well. I did a study abroad, and it helped me a lot, but obviously, this option isn't available to everyone. I will also say, though, that the whole study abroad thing is a little bit overhyped. It's perfectly feasible to get quite proficient in Vietnamese without ever even visiting the country. And likewise, if you have bad study habits, then just spending a semester in Vietnam isn't going to solve all your problems. Rather, it's the time you spend studying and practicing that actually improves your Vietnamese. And you can study anywhere. Dictionaries are one of the most important resources in language learning. I mostly use Wiktionary, but VDict is also a good option. Google Translate gets a lot of hate, but I've seen it pull off miracles. And it also has a massive vocabulary, so if you ever stumble upon a word that isn't listed in Wiktionary, you can often find it through Google Translate instead. On the other hand, though, Google Translate can make some pretty silly errors, so just be careful. The last thing I want to say about dictionaries is a general rule of thumb, which says that during your studies, you should find yourself consulting the dictionary often, and if you're not, there's a good chance you're doing it wrong. Typing is a really important skill, and I'm always surprised by how many people will learn a foreign language but never learn to type in it. And I think the problem comes down to a simple lack of information. Because believe it or not, your keyboard, the one you use to type in English, can be very easily configured to type in Vietnamese. So go on the internet and look up a guide to install the Vietnamese keyboard on your device. There are two popular layouts for the Vietnamese keyboard. One is called the number key layout, which replaces all the numbers with special characters, while the other one is called telex, which is a little bit more complicated, but allows you to type the numbers more easily. Whichever one you choose is just a matter of personal preference. Just keep in mind that you really won't be able to progress very easily if you never learn to type. Reading can be a really good way to learn a second language, because depending on the material, it can be a really enjoyable process that exposes you to a lot of new vocabulary. The best reading material is something that interests you, but is also slightly above your current level. So depending on where you're at, this could be something like a children's book that you enjoy for nostalgia's sake, a blog you find online, or an actual novel like Dune or Hunger Games or something. Now, reading materials in Vietnamese can be a little bit hard to come by, but if you do get your hands on something, then this is a really good option. Watching TV is my personal favorite method of language learning, but you have to be careful with this one. First things first, most Vietnamese TV is kind of awful. Your best option is to find the Vietnamese dub of a foreign show instead. And as it happens, if you look on my channel, I've actually uploaded some episodes of My Little Pony in Vietnamese. And while I know that it can be a little bit strange to watch a kids show, it's actually a really good way to engage with a foreign language. Now, if you do go with this option though, I need to instruct you on how to engage with it, because so many people have the idea of learning a language through TV, but end up going about it in the completely wrong way, and mostly just waste their time. Because when you're watching TV in Vietnamese, you're not there to sit back and relax. You're there to listen to spoken Vietnamese and teach yourself to parse through it. So here's what you do. Take a pencil and paper, start up an episode of My Little Pony, I would go with this one first, and then listen to the first sentence.
Cảm ơn rất nhiều chị Zikora.
Did you understand what she said? If so, write it down. If not, let's listen again.
Cảm ơn rất nhiều chị Zikora.
Oh man, I just can't figure out what she said. Let's listen again.
Cảm ơn rất nhiều chị Zikora.
Let's check the subtitles.
Cảm ơn rất nhiều chị.
Oh, of course, that's what she said. If you keep doing this, you'll get better and better at understanding spoken Vietnamese, and you'll get more and more used to the Vietnamese accent. It's a really good way to pick up new vocabulary, sentence structures, and pronunciation. So if you're willing to watch My Little Pony, then I would absolutely recommend that you use this method, because it's really effective. Listening to music can be a really good option, but I personally have never been into Vietnamese music, so I don't know what artists to recommend. If you find a song you like, it can be a really fun process to translate and then memorize a song. Just be warned though that song lyrics can sometimes be a little bit of a different style than spoken language. While grammar and phonology and pragmatics and stuff are all really fun to talk about, the bulk of your studies should really be focused on vocabulary, because in order to speak Vietnamese proficiently, you'll need to know a handful of grammar rules, you'll need a little bit of practice with pronunciation, and you'll need to know thousands of words. So the bulk of your studies should really consist of using flashcards, because although they can be a little bit boring, they're incredibly effective at teaching you vocabulary words. I personally study flashcards through an app called Quizlet. It's currently the best flashcard app out there, but the company's been on a trend for the last 2 years or so of slowly phasing out all of the best features, so the future doesn't look too good for Quizlet users. Another popular option is Anki. I've never used it, but a lot of people really like it, so you might want to check it out. But the safest option is to probably just use actual flashcards made out of paper. This kind of advice is a little bit trite, but it is true. Learning to set small, achievable goals is a really important part of self-growth. So during your studies, try to find some short-term goals to keep yourself motivated. Vietnamese pronunciation is really difficult and also just really weird. If you want to be able to speak Vietnamese well, then you're gonna have to practice, and that'll often entail sitting alone in a room somewhere and repeating a syllable or a sound over and over again. And if you're anything like me, then that process is gonna be really weird and you're gonna feel really self-conscious. But you really need to overcome this feeling, because if you're too afraid to put yourself out there because you think Vietnamese sounds silly or something, then you'll never be able to say "Người tên là gì" in a convincing manner. So when you're speaking Vietnamese, I'd recommend you really try to set your self-consciousness aside and go for it. And thus concludes the final section of this video. To anyone still listening, thank you for your time. I hope that this video helped you. The whole thing has been a massive project and I really underestimated how much time it would take, but I'm really hoping that it'll help people out. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. But until then, I hope you have a good day and I wish you good luck in your studies. Thank you.